I was asked to address two topics, really, two questions, trends in runoff, and then effects on water administration. And of course, that's what the Division of Water Resources does, is water administration. The one thing I'll mention is that first slide talked about a case study using the La Plata River. I'm not going to use the Animas River because it's a water-rich river system. Just as an example, Durango diverts about the equivalent of 1 day in the summer of water for its use, and then half of that returns to the river after being used. So a 50% return rate. So yeah, Durango doesn't put a big stress on the Animas River. So we're going to go west over to the La Plata River, and that's where I'll do a little bit of discussion here. So the La Plata River at the Hesperus gauge. So where that sits is about 15 miles west of here, where Highway 160 crosses the La Plata River. There's a gauging station there. It's strategically put there for compact purposes. And what this represents is each bar represents the total flow over the year in acre feet. And this covers a 100-year period. And what you notice is there's quite a variability year to year. So of course, I'll just give the example, in 1920, there was nearly 55,000 acre feet that crossed that gauge. And again, the reason this gauge sits is because of compact purpose, which I'll get into a little bit later. The other thing, you see a lot of variability. It's hard to see trend. So I'll give you a couple of other slides to give you an idea of how we might look at what trends are doing with that particular stream. I started doing work in the water resources field in the 1980s. I was lucky enough at the age of 19 to start helping with stream gauging on the Colorado River, and one of the stations was the compact point, the Lee's Ferry. So my perspective right off the bat was tons of water. This represents essentially an average for each decade. So decades are kind of the way I think. So we put the slide together to give, I think a lot of people think that way. The 80s were pretty water rich, and every year since then, each decade is gotten a little bit drier. I also have talked to, what I'd say the old timers, and they would talk about the 50s and 60s being a very dry time. Going back to the 1920s, that's when the compacts, in particular, the La Plata compact and the Colorado River compact, were drafted. Looking back at records, now this is the entire record we have for this gauge. Looking at other data, we can see that the 1910 period was a pretty wet year. Going back into the 1800s, especially when this area was first becoming more developed, a lot of the old ditches were being first put in. That was actually a fairly dry period. We don't have a record for that here, but it was actually a dry period and probably reflects closer to the 60s and 70s. So variability has been part of the scene for a long time. Why don't we go to the next slide? So on this slide, the 20s decadal average hydrograph is that blue line, and it was a pretty good time back in the 20s. Maybe not every year, but the average was pretty good. And then that red line represents the 2010 period, and you can see it's quite a bit lower. And then the average, it's just slightly lower than that dashed line, which represents the average. It's actually moved, the peak is moved earlier in the season, which is what we heard a little earlier, and it's dropping off a lot quicker. So anyways, that's what we're seeing, and that's what we're kind of seeing in administration as well. Another thing to point out is the late summer flows, which sustain a lot of the agricultural water rights. It's a little bit less than it has been in the past as well. So I'm going to get out of that now. All that data was for the Hesperus gauge. So now I'm going to get into water administration, the priority system in particular, and how it accounts for variability in supply and demand. And of course, it's based in the priority system, first in time, first in right. And I'll apologize to some of the attorneys and consultants, because it might be a little elementary for you guys, obviously, but there's a lot of people in the room that just don't do this kind of work every day, and I want to speak to them as well so they understand what we're getting at here. Water rights, getting a water right gets you a spot in line in the priority system. It establishes your priority or your place in line when there's a shortage of water, right? I mean, and so let's just go through a quick history, and I'll try to do it quickly. Pre-statehood in the pre-1870 kind of time frame, there was no water rights system, and there were some early users. And who are those early users? Native American tribes, and then there was some mining that was going on in Colorado too. There was no need for a priority system because there's plenty of water. As we're moving along the 1870s into the 1900s, there was early agricultural growth. Most of the ditches in this area and across the state really were developed in that time period. And for the most part, there was plenty of water. Of course, as more and more farmers and towns were coming in, started to be some conflict between folks, and there was a need for administration. A priority system was established, and then that wasn't even enough. So people started to, as agricultural growth continued, populations expanded, they decided, well, obviously there's a need for more water in the late summer, so there was a reservoir building, and that carried water from the heavy spring runoff season, obviously, into the latter part of the summer. That did a fair amount of good for the communities. In the Front Range, the next 20 years saw a lot of trans-mountain diversions go in, and reservoir building along with that. So, the population was trying to use every bit of water, and they found ways to do that, right? So here's our priority system. The earliest users got the benefit of the water when it was at the extremely low end, and some of those less or more junior water rights were cut off, right? So, and that's, well, I jumped ahead, but the junior water rights go out of priority is essentially what we're saying, depending on how much water is in the river. And what does that look like with real administration is people start getting cut off. And who does that work but the Division of Water Resources? This is a water commissioner that's out in the field. He's actually out on the La Plata, turning a head gate. Somebody's getting shut off, depending on, and that's a daily thing. Every day, those guys are up and down the river, depending on how much is in the river, shutting them on or turning them off, depending on what their priority is, right? So, with an increase in demand and a decrease in supply, cities and high-value users want to buy senior water rights. They want to assure that they're going to have a supply. And so what do? They start, buying up old water rights, transferring them into their system. You'll hear the word buy and dry. So they're buying old farms with great priorities, transferring that water right into their system, and so that they can have a reliable supplies for their populations. It's kind of just that simple. The process isn't simple. That's why there's attorneys and consultants in the room. Quite complicated, but that's the effort. It's a market-driven process. What happens when you introduce a compact? Well, at the very end of that line there, that's what I've tried to represent. Actually, most of these compacts were developed in the 1920s, but in fact, they weren't given a water right. Now, they're written into statute, so we have an obligation, obviously, to downstream states, right? But there are no water rights, so they're really not in the priority system. But if there's a call, as there is every year on the La Plata River, that compact becomes our first obligation. We have to live up to our state law and our obligation to downstream states. It essentially puts them at the front of the line. They become our top priority, and then everyone else is adjusted beyond that. What happens? Junior water rights in Colorado become less reliable because you've had to compensate the whole system for that additional, what I'd say, a senior use from a downstream state. And here's just a picture of the Long Hollow Reservoir, which is located on the lower end of the La Plata system. And it was built partially to deliver water to the state line for the compact. It also does an exchange, which really helps the compact as well. And so we're obviously, from a water administration standpoint, we're looking for tools like that to help our administration and help relieve some of the pressures on in-state users in order to compensate for needs downstream. So That's it for me.